All right. So it's 3 o'clock, and I finally have to get this done. My name is Janani Subbiah, and first off, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Today, I'm going to be talking about some very simple code review tips and tricks that I have found very useful during my tenure as a software engineer. Um, but before we get into that, a little bit about me. I'm a software engineer, and most of my experience comes from working on Android apps and backend services. And surprise, I come from India. If other things are not conveying that, they should obviously. And I currently work for a company called Detroit Labs based in Detroit, Michigan, USA. So this is what my talk's going to look like today. I'm going to start us off with why I think etiquette's important, especially in the context of a non-verbal and more formal setting like a code review. And then I'll be talking about etiquettes, which is going to be the meat of my talk. I'll start us off with reviewer etiquettes, followed by team etiquettes, things that software delivery teams as a whole need to be mindful of to set the stage for good etiquette. And finally, I'll be wrapping up my talk with the author etiquettes, things that people who are actually putting up code reviews need to keep in mind when they're doing that. So first up is, why is etiquette important? Why are we even talking about etiquettes in the context of a code review? It's nonverbal, it's formal, and it's more technical in nature. Why don't we just say what we want to say? Here is why it's important. Albert Mehrabian, in his book titled Silent Messages, Implicit Communication of Emotions and Attitudes, mentions that for verbal communications involving emotions like feelings of likes and dislikes, there are three things that effectively decide how efficient those communications are going to be. 55% of that comes from what he calls facial liking, which is, are you frowning or are you smiling when you're having that communication? Long story short, your facial expressions. 38% comes from vocal liking, which is, are you screaming when you're saying something, or are you whispering? What does the tone and the pitch of your voice sound like when you're having the communication? And finally, there's the final 7%, which comes from verbal liking, which is mostly the words that you use to have that communication. If you're wondering how this applies to code reviews, here is how I think it applies. Code reviews are also communications of feelings, likes, and dislikes. And the reason I say that is, as software engineers, sometimes we tend to hold on to our opinions pretty tightly. So there's that. And code reviews are nonverbal, meaning there is no talking involved. And that means that the 7% out of this pie chart is all we have access to. We only have the words to convey what we want to say and make sure that it's received positively. And we only have that 7% to make up for the rest of the 93% to make sure what we're saying is meaningful and impactful and is also received that way. So on that note, we'll be looking at some things that reviewers on code reviews need to be mindful of. These are all very simple things that I have found really useful. The first one, and probably one of the most important ones for reviewers, is to actively tell yourself every time you do a code review that this is a code review and it's not a review of the author who actually put up the code review. This can be hard sometimes because not all of us have the same kind of relationship with everybody on our team. But I think this is very important. There are a couple of things about this I'm going to touch on. The first one is a study that was conducted recently in 2017 titled Gender Differences and Bias in Open Source, Pull Request Acceptance Rates Between Women and Men. And this study basically analyzed data available on GitHub to draw some conclusions. And it's very interesting. They have a bunch of conclusions. The one thing that caught my attention was this. On an average, they found that women had an acceptance rate of 78.7%, while men, on the other hand, had a 74.6. And when I came across this, I was taken by surprise because this did not align with everything that I was reading about the tech industry, or I was hearing from people, or I was seeing in general. So I kept reading, and here is another chunk of their conclusion. They found that women's acceptance rates were higher only when they were not identifiable as women. And this is to prove my point that make sure that as reviewers, when you do reviews, make sure that you're not reviewing the author. Instead, make sure that the focus is where it belongs, in the code that's actually been changed. And I think given all the bias, given everything that's being talked about, the tech industry, it's time we started making a change. And code reviews are a great place to start because we spend a chunk of our time doing code reviews on any project we're on. So the second thing about keeping in mind that this is not an author review is to make sure that everybody, irrespective of who they are, what fancy titles they have, or how long they've been on the team or the industry in general, it's important to make sure that nobody is getting a free pass to production. So make sure that irrespective of who puts up a code review, hold everybody to the same high standards and make sure that all the code is reviewed the same way. The second one is to use questions in place of commands for code review comments. So here is an example. Either change it or don't do this. And depending on how the author decides to read this, and maybe even depending on how long they've been a software engineer, their reaction could be one of these two. It could be, I broke something, and probably today's the day I'm going to get fired, and I've really made this person very mad. Or it could be, I don't like the tone of that code review comment. And note that the tone that the author decides to attach to this comment need not necessarily be how the person who wrote it intended for it to be read. But that doesn't matter because that person has only words and doesn't have access to the tone or the intentions. But instead, if they had decided to say something along the lines of, could this be changed? Let's say even if they were 100% sure that it could, it makes the author think about the change that's being proposed. And it puts the focus where it belongs, back in the code and back in the suggestion itself, versus in some imaginary tone that nobody has any control over. The next one for reviewers is to link out to resources. And when I say resources, I'm referring to public forums like Stack Overflow that actually provide solutions to a certain problem based on related to the suggestion you're making, or they could also be documentation links. And this is very helpful because it provides better understanding. You don't have to go on and on about why you're asking for a certain change. Instead, you say what you're asking for, and then you provide this link that provides that better understanding that the author can get all that knowledge from. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it'll also tell you what not to do, what to keep away from. For instance, reflections in Java, everybody keeps saying keep away from them, except all the big frameworks use them. So things like that are always welcome and very helpful. The next one is to explain. Explain something that's very specific to your project. Sometimes we have anti-patterns in our code. We don't necessarily use a framework exactly how it was intended to be used by the authors of the framework, or there is some project-specific knowledge. And for things like that, make sure to provide that additional explanation so that the author understands why you're asking for what you're asking. It provides additional context, and it also provides consistency because now the author is going to take this to not just other sections of the code, but also other code reviews that they may be on. The next one, and one of my personal favorites, is to be conscious of the scope of the review. I'm sure a lot of us in this room have started working on a 3-point card. It turns into this monstrous 8-point card a week later because there was one reviewer who asked for a change. And probably you as the author thought, I'm here anyway, I'm going to make this change, except all the million tests that you overlooked are now broken, or there are cascading changes that need to be made that were probably not accounted for when the change was initially asked. So I think as reviewers, we could be aware of what I like to call scope creep. Make sure you understand the scope of the review, and make sure what changes or what cascading changes your suggestions could lead to. But sometimes we have this thing. We have to say it because we can't live with ourselves if we don't say it, just because it's not within the scope of the review. So maybe say it and ask everybody and the author what they think. Is this something that can fit in this review? Does this need to be a separate card? And all of those things. And if they need to be a separate card, depending on what project management or tracking tool you use, offer to make those additional cards because you have all the information that needs to be recorded in those cards for somebody else to actually pick it up and work on. And finally, very importantly, also make sure to only review sections of the code that have actually changed. Most code review tools highlight the sections that have changed, but at the same time, they also display a few lines of code above and below the change sections. Make sure to review only those change sections and not everything that's in display. The next one is documenting offline conversations. Sometimes we have this wonderful idea, and we are convinced that it's not going to be possible to capture all our thoughts within the context of a code review comment. So what we do is we end up having face-to-face, which is what I mean by offline conversations outside of the code review itself, either with the author or with other members on the team. Necessarily not everybody all the time. And what this leads to is when the next reviewer comes in, and let's say the author has decided to take your suggestion and make those changes, they're going to be really confused. They're going to spend a lot of time thinking about why this change was made and why it was necessary to start with. So make sure to capture all that information and all that conversations that happened outside of the context of the review in the review itself, so that it's better use of everybody's time who comes next and they know what's going on. And it leads to less confusion. Nobody is now confused about why was this change even made or where did it come from. And finally, if you're like me and you remember the exact time you made a GitHub commit, you remember what the weather looked like that day, you remember the week of the day, and all of those nice things except why you changed something, this will really serve as a good potential future reference, and your future you will be very thankful. The next one is to use the word we instead of the word you. And this is one of those very simple changes that go a long way in building very healthy relationships and teams. So let's consider a couple of code review examples here. The first one is, you should update this to the latest version available, versus saying we should update this to the latest version available. You're right if you're thinking it's just a switch between the word you and we, except under the hood, it's also this. You singles the author out, and the author could read it as, this code review comment is directed at me, and I'm being singled out, and I'm being asked to make this change. Versus we, on the other hand, brings about a sense of inclusiveness and reinforces the thought of we're all in this together, because we really are. This code base is a shared entity. It's shared between everybody on the team, irrespective of whether you code or not. If you're on the team, this is a shared entity, and it's up to all of us to maintain it and manage it responsibly. And using we instead of the word you really reinforces that. The next one that I am totally guilty of not doing more often than I'd like to admit is this: taking a step back and making sure that I'm reviewing the card that the PR actually stemmed from. So for all the reviewers out there, make sure to review the card. Make sure to not just jump into the code or the code review, look at the title, look at all the code changes, maybe make suggestions, give feedback, and then or approve it, and then just be out. I think it's important to complete that loop, go back to the card, if you're using Jira, maybe the Jira card or the story, and make sure that everything that's been called out has a code change in the PR. And on the flip side, more importantly, I think it's very important to make sure that there are not code changes for things that have not been called out. If you're wondering why this is important, and if you're thinking, maybe just look at the code to see what's changed, I think your project management tool might be a central place that everybody else on your team, especially the ones who don't code, like your project managers or your delivery leads or designers and QA, are going to be looking at. That could potentially be your central source of truth, and having code changes that are not called out for in the card takes away the transparency, and now when hell breaks loose, it might be easy for you to go back and trace back why, but it might be hard for others. The next one I think is very important is to make sure that when you call out a suggestion or when you make a code review comment that's more a suggestion versus could this please be changed before this can be merged, make sure to convey that it's a suggestion. There are at least a couple of ways to do this. The first one is to use symbols. At Detroit Labs, where I work, we use the cake emoji. So a suggestion, a code review comment which needs to be read as a suggestion would look like this. It would be the cake emoji followed by, what are your thoughts on doing this thing? So that the author or anybody who's reading it actually understands that this is a suggestion and they can take it or they can choose to ignore it as well. On a side note, one of the questions I had when I joined my company was why we use the cake emoji. And this was the reason I was given. So the cake itself is a perfectly good cake. It's the current state of the code without the suggestions that you're making. And the code with the suggestions you're making is probably the cake with an icing. And depending on whether you like your cake with icing or without icing, you can either choose to take that comment or drop it and keep the code the same way. I thought it was just interesting to understand why they use the cake emoji. The other thing I do more often is to actually explicitly say it. So I like to do something along the lines of this. I don't feel strongly about this thing I'm going to say, but I'm still going to say it. And you can choose to ignore it. I also tag that on so that the author very clearly knows beyond any doubt that they can take the suggestion or not. It's up to them, and I'm just making this as a suggestion, and that's clearly conveyed to them. The next one is to take the time to do it right, the 0th time, just because everything in our world is 0 indexed. So imagine this, you come into work on a really nice Friday, and it's extra special because that one PR that's been open for a long time is going to be closed because you've addressed all the big changes, you've addressed all the changes, and you're just waiting for final approvals. Except you come in and you find out that one of the reviewers has asked for a change in that one section of the code review that has remained unchanged through all the 10 times you pushed up code changes. I think it's a little unfair to the author at that point. I think as reviewers, it's important to try and catch these things much early on and make sure that we're not asking for big changes that could take days and that essentially end up making cards bigger cards than they were initially intended to. And we need to make sure that we're not asking for changes later on. Make sure to catch them early and make sure to ask for make sure that change requests in unchanged sections either give the option of creating a separate card for it, or if they really need to happen, maybe offer to help. This can be hard with long reviews, and I know most of us don't like long reviews, and we try to avoid it as much as possible, but they still happen sometimes. And what I like to do with long reviews is I don't do them in one stretch. I like to take a break. So either I go get some coffee, talk to a colleague or something like that, so that I'm always coming back to the code review with a fresh set of eyes and I'm catching all those big things much early on. The next one is to lump up similar suggestions. Let's say the author puts up a code review, the first reviewer comes in and finds a pattern in the code changes, they find that either formatting is off or there are typos all over the place, and they decide to go ahead and make a code review comment on every single line of the code where something needs to be changed. And if the code review tool you're using generates an email for every code review comment, when the author comes back and sees 40 emails in less than 5 or 6 minutes, if I were that author, that would be my reaction. Instead, I think what reviewers can do is maybe make a single comment on the entire code review or a single comment for the entire file, calling out all the places where they need to be changed. This is also helpful in tracking. So if you have all of that information in one place, after the author has made changes, they can go back and look at that comment and make sure that every line that's been called out has been fixed and addressed. This one is one of my favorites. And I wish somebody had said this to me when I started out as a software engineer. No suggestion is ever too small to be made or said. When I started out, the team I was on needed to have everybody on the team approve PRs before they can be merged into master. And so I ended up getting put on a bunch of PRs. But I never said anything. I was full of questions. I had a bunch of suggestions, but I had more questions than suggestions. I never asked. I never said anything because I had more excuses I would tell myself. I always told myself that this person who's putting up this PR has been on the team for 10, 15 years and they know better. Or if this is something really important, then somebody else is going to say it. Or I would just say, I was wrong and I shouldn't bring this up. Except what I did not realize back then was this. Everybody's questions, everybody's opinion really, really matters. It doesn't matter where you are in your career or how new you are to your team, or whether you think you're a junior or a senior. If you have a question, if you have feedback, and you're being put on a code review, you need to feel empowered to voice your opinion. And there is absolutely no harm in asking or suggesting. In fact, it's very helpful because there could be somebody else on your team who feels the same way, and you asking these questions or making these suggestions could help them come out of their shell. Code reviews don't have to be a place where all the reviewers go, hey, author, this needs to change, this needs to be upgraded, and this needs to be done. It can be a two-way street. So I always like to ask for feedback on my suggestions. If I'm making a code review comment, asking for a certain version upgrade or asking for a certain change in the code, I like to find out what the author thinks about that. So I like to do something along the lines of, I think we could pull in a library for doing this. What are your thoughts on it? This makes the author in part to give their opinion, and it opens the door to conversation, which is always good because probably there's a much better solution out there that could come out of that conversation. And I like to do this too. I like to find out if I'm missing something because I tend to get very embarrassed when I say something and I actually find out that I'm missing something. So I like to tack it on like this. I think a method for this already exists, and it looks like we're not using it. Is there a reason? What am I missing here? The next one is to actually show your appreciation. Code reviews don't have to be a place where you're just asking for changes or just giving your approval. You can also appreciate, and most code review tools give you a bunch of emojis to show your appreciation. I love them if it's not obvious by now. So use all of these emojis to show your appreciation. If you see good patterns in the code, and I'm probably going to get into trouble for saying this, but if you see good unit tests, appreciate that because there are so many code bases without those. So on that note, I have reached the end of all the reviewer etiquettes I had. Next, I'm going to be talking about some team etiquettes. These are not necessarily things that get into the weeds of a code review itself. They're more things that teams as a whole could be and should be doing around code reviews or in their software lifecycle management to make sure that the stage is actually set for good code review etiquette. The first one is to use a good pull request template and to make sure that it's being used on every pull request that goes up. Here is an example of what we do on my team. Here is a pull request template, and it asks for things about what the PR does. This is at a very high level. What it does, is it fixing a bug, is it adding a new feature, and things like that. And then we actually get into the weeds of the implementation itself. What are the classes that have been touched? Has documentation been updated? What are the changes that have been made? And how were these changes tested? And all of those things. And then there is testing steps, screenshots if applicable. And finally, there is a testing checklist, which is more of a checklist for the person who's actually putting up this PR so that they know that they've done all these things. And these are also things that everyone tends to miss most often. So I like PR templates because I think it sets the stage for good etiquette as it makes sure that the author is giving all the reviewers all the information they may need to successfully do this review before they get started with this review. And if you're using GitHub, GitHub also provides options for using specific and very customized pull request templates for things like bugs or features. So you could have different pull request templates because depending on what you're doing in your code, you might want different information. Just make sure to make a pull request for your pull request template, and also make sure that this is something that's captured in a centralized document like your project charter document so that everybody on the team is held accountable to filling this out every time they put a pull request. The next one is to be mindful of and make sure that different people on the team are doing pre or post PR tasks. These could be specific to the reviewer or the author. So these could be things like the reviewer needs to move a certain card or the card that they're reviewing from a certain column in your project management tool to a different column before they start reviewing it. Or they need to assign themselves to a PR if only one approval is required so that multiple people are not looking at it, and finally only one of them needs to actually approve it, or move a card to another column after they're done, just to make sure that that status is communicated effectively. These could also be author tasks, like making sure that the relevant labels are on your PR. This in particular could be very helpful because let's say you're making a bug fix for a version that's actually out in production and it's already been released, and given not everybody on the team always finds a big chunk of time available for all code reviews, maybe they're just doing it 1 hour every day, and giving the reviewers this information could make sure that they could prioritize it depending on how fast it needs to get out the door. The next one is to make sure that you're asking for approvals or reapprovals from people who may have previously approved your code review, but now that's been dismissed because you made some changes after that. The next one that I think team should be doing early on in the project, and they could end up on final numbers around how many people should be approving PRs before it can be merged with some trial and error too. But something that needs to start early on is to make sure that there is a good number of approvals that needs to be those many number of approvals need to be on a PR before it can be successfully merged into master. There are at least two options here. The first one is to have the entire team approve all PRs that are ever merged into master. This, depending on your team size, could be good or bad. The bad is you could have things hanging in PR for a really long time if your team is really big. The other option is to have exactly one person at a time, not always the same person, but just one person at a time approve PRs. And the problem with this could be, it could potentially lead to silos. There could be just one or two people who are totally aware of all the changes happening in a certain section of the code base. And this can get really frustrating for that one or two people. I think these are two options, but there is a balance to be found here between these two. Maybe both of these don't work for your team, but make sure to find the right balance. And here are some things I think teams could consider to find that balance. The team size. How big is your team? Could you actually have everybody review PRs? If it's a 2-person team, you probably could. Or if it's a 20-person team, that doesn't work. So depending on your team size, make sure to finalize your number of approvals. The next one is, how big is the code? If it's too big, there probably isn't one single person who knows everything about the code. Maybe there are people who know specific sections of the code in depth. The next one is to understand what legacy portions exist in your code or what legacy dependencies exist. And finally, project ramp-up time. How long is it really going to take somebody to ramp up on your project before they can actually be doing code reviews and giving meaningful feedback? This one is really important, and I think a lot of teams sometimes miss out on this. It's important to realize and make sure that you're actually allocating time required for code reviews early on. This could be your sprint planning meetings or any of your team recurring meetings. Make sure to think of your sprint commitment as the total number of points your team's signing up for, plus all the time that it's going to take to actually get those reviews in. So if it's 80 points worth work, you need to understand, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that all of those 80 points actually need to be reviewed because before it can be merged in. And this is really important because giving code reviews their due time leads to higher code quality and potentially lower tech debt because you're probably catching all those bugs and things that need to be fixed much early on. The next one is to diffuse toxic behavior. It doesn't matter if you're not the author or a certain reviewer. If you're somebody on the team or somebody who's seeing toxic behavior in a certain project that you're on, this could come in the form of very unhelpful comments, rude or sarcastic comments. If you see any of these, make sure to step in and diffuse that behavior because that is just not okay. There are two things that need to happen, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. The first thing is to actually provide that feedback to the person who made one of those comments. Make sure to give them constructive feedback. Make sure to let them know that what they did was not okay and it's not something that should be tolerated. And the next one is to actually follow up with comments. So if someone's said something very unhelpful like change this, maybe follow up and make sure that you're adding that additional context around what they meant by just change this, what needs to be changed, how can you change it, so that the person reading it feels more safe making those changes. So with that, I'm at the end of my team etiquettes. This is the final section of my talk. I'll be going over some etiquettes for reviewers, for authors, things that authors putting up a code review need to keep in mind as they're putting up the code review. The first one, which is also the flip side of reviewers making sure that they're reviewing the code and not the author, is this: you are not your code. On my first ever code review, I made 20 lines of change and I got 33 comments. I felt like I was going down a downward spiral of, I'm just horrible at this, I should probably quit my career because I have more comments than the number of lines have changed. And it was not even a big change. And all the feedback that I had received was really good and things that needed to be said. Yet, I found myself going that downward spiral. So if you find yourself going down the downward spiral, make sure to take a step back, take a deep breath, and disassociate you and your code. You are not your code. All those comments coming in are for the code. All those changes being requested are for the code. And you just happen to be the person who will be making those changes. And they are not directed at you. And this can be sometimes very hard to realize and tell yourself, but I think practicing it makes it much easier. And once you've done that, make sure to ask the right questions that will actually help you with making those changes. So once you've stopped yourself from going down that path, make sure to take a step back and ask questions like, why is this change being requested? Is this something that's existent in other places in the code, or is this a new pattern that I'm supposed to follow? Make sure to ask how to make those changes. And also make sure to ask for examples. How can I actually make this change? And are there other places in the code or out in the wild I can use as reference to make this change? The next one that I think is forgotten very often is you don't have to wait for reviewers to start commenting on your code review. You can be the first person to make that first comment. I like to comment on my own code reviews after I've put them up for a review, at least for a couple of things. The first one is I like to ask for suggestions. I struggle with naming all the time, be it methods, variables. I struggle with naming anything all the time. And sometimes I spend a lot of time struggling with something like this. And I either end up coming up with names that are just too long and halfway through you don't know what I'm saying, or they're just really short and they don't convey anything about what they're supposed to be doing. So I struggle for a little bit, and then I tell myself that I need to be asking for help. So I come up with the one option that I hate the least, and I put that up, and I ask my team for suggestions on what they think or other suggestions they might have, because some people on my team are really awesome at this. The next thing is to address the obvious whys. If there is something that you know somebody is going to have questions about, maybe you're breaking pattern in the code or in the code review that you're putting up because there is a new pattern and you're going to make a similar change in other sections of the code review, make sure to address that because you know it's going to come up. And the reviewers, when they see your comment, they'll have an aha moment, and that's an amazing feeling. The last one for authors is to give yourself your own review. Make sure to get your approval first before you hit that button and actually put stuff up for a review. And this saves a lot of time because you're making sure to catch certain obvious things that you might catch on other code reviews earlier on, and your PR is going out the door with at least one approval. On that note, I've almost reached the end of my talk, and here is one of my favorite quotes from the world of Twitter that I think really applies to this talk. It's ask a programmer to review 10 lines of code, and they'll find 10 issues. Ask them to do 500 lines, and they'll say it looks good. When my husband saw this, his first question was, oh, so you're telling people that they need to make giant PRs so that they have to make fewer changes? So I'd like to clarify that. That's definitely not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. Make sure to make much smaller PRs that are easy to make PRs for, as well as easy to review. And more importantly, make sure that you're getting the best and the most out of all the time you spend on code reviews. Make sure all the feedback you're giving and receiving is actually done in positive and more impactful and meaningful way. And now I've really reached the end of my talk. You can reach me on Twitter. Feel free to come up and talk to me. I'm going to be hanging back here for a little bit. If you have any questions or feedback, let me know. Thanks for coming.